All right, welcome to our September 29th common session. The song remains the same. We've had a little bit of technical difficulties and we're working through it. So our first guest speaker, Professor Amy Forbes, is going to be coming over in a few minutes as we were having problems with her microphone. My name is Jim Capriti. I work at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in the Classics Department. And this year, my first-year seminar is studying leadership in antiquity. It's the first time we've done a live broadcast, so this is rather exciting for us. And what I wanted to do tonight is start off with why I chose this module to study Spartan leadership, how I tried to organize the module, and then I want to turn it over to a few of my students to work with Dr. Amy Forbes, who's the Associate Director for our Centennial Center for Leadership at Hobart William Smith College, and also one of the executives on the International Leadership Association. So I chose this module because I thought it would be interesting to see how Spartan leadership changed over the course of the 5th century. In the summer of 425, as many of you know, 292 Spartans beaten, surrounded, and with little hope of support coming from the mainland. Sorry, we're experiencing some technical experiences here. Anyhow, with this, Steve, do you keep muting me? Sorry, one of my students has control of all of this and he keeps muting me. I think we're okay now. So with this capitulation, we see this image of Spartan leadership almost shattered. Thucydides writes that the general impression, and I quote, had been that Spartans would never surrender their arms, whether because of hunger or any form of compulsion. Instead, they would keep them to the last and die fighting as best they could. So this event on Sphakteria remains one of the more memorable in Thucydides' histories and in Spartan history, mainly because this ethos of Spartan, one that Thucydides will refer to on several different occasions, seems to be shattered. Now, a close examination of what happened on Pylos and comparing it to the context of the Peloponnesian War and Sparta in the 5th century, I was hoping to reveal tension between the image of Spartan leadership, what other Greeks thought was Spartan leadership, and what was the reality of Spartan leadership. I also thought it would be a good way to study what happens when leadership fails, or when followers look to the leaders and the leaders don't have answers or can't solve the problems. So as we considered Pylos, I wanted the module to weave our way backwards in time towards Thermopylae, the creation of the Spartan state, and whether people read Xenophon or Lycurgus, they could then have something to compare the Pylos episode to. And then my hope was at the end of the module, we would get into some later studies with Brasidas and Agesilaus II. So tonight, we're going to start off with a discussion with two of our students, Tony and Connor, who are going to start answering a question. And as soon as Amy Forbes can get over here, she can give us her expertise and analysis on this. But they're going to start us off by answering a question about leadership past to present, just as we're studying leadership in Sparta, past to present, 5th century. The question that Dr. Forbes wants to ask our students is, how has leadership changed in our own culture from its past to present? So what I'm going to do is switch over to our students, Tony and Connor. They're going to be sharing a computer, and let them have it.
All right, I'm Connor.
I'm Tony.
And I don't know what to say until Professor gets here.
What should we say for now?
Just you can answer the question, how do you think leadership has changed in the United States?
Okay. Do you want to take this from the turn of the millennium or just over time?
It's up to you.
I guess we'll start from the year 2000. You know, obviously back then it was, I don't know where to start.
It's a hard question, right?
Well, leadership has changed, obviously, and it's
I think based on, I mean, the debate, the presidential debate went on this Monday. I think a lot of us watched it. There were record numbers watching the debate this Monday, more than there has been in any past debate. And it's interesting to see the way the dialogue has shifted in the past, even in the past 4 years since the Obama-Romney election back in 2012. We see this candidates starting to focus on not just the issues of policy, but leaning also towards issues of morality and ethics, and in some cases just slamming each other and in order to
Basically, they want to prove their point that their candidate's not worthy. And in the past elections, although we have seen them basically talk trash about each other, at this election, it's a new level of that. There's a lot of things that can be said about both candidates comparatively. We have an outsider from the politics who seems a little nuts. Then we have someone who's not really the most trusted in the political world, I guess you could say. And, there's just a lot to talk about on that front. But in the past elections, although you do see.
And we do see, I mean, we've studied politicians from antiquity, and you see when they argue, I mean, we represented the Corinthians in an argument, and some of the arguments are, it's easy to draw some comparisons in the way, I mean, politicians are a lot the same throughout history and even in other countries, but it's interesting to see some of these comparisons between the two.
Do you think rhetoric has played a greater role in how
Rhetoric, you said?
Yeah, rhetoric has played a greater role in how the politicians present themselves. Do you think that they present themselves as authentic?
No. I think they try and create an image which will appease the voters of their party. Trump goes on this crazy tear about building a wall and whatnot, and Hillary, she not does the same thing, but she still tries and appease to their voters. You can also look at them, and the politicians back in the day, I wouldn't say they really focused on as many social issues. And, they focused more on, they still focused on social issues, obviously, with the women's rights movement and even going back to slavery. But, now we're really getting in depth with it. And what we used, stop?
No, you're fine. I just only got a couple of minutes for this. I want to get Professor Forbes time when she comes back, and I know you prepared a question for her. So we're going to wait for her to come over to our classroom, and then you'll get to pick this up. Is that okay?
Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys. So as we're waiting, what I thought I would do is switch to one of the theories I added to the module. As I was looking around for different, excuse me. Now I get it.
All right, I'm sorry about that. Can everybody hear me now? Yes, okay, I'm getting used to this technology. One of the theories I thought that we would look at as we explored this module started really in the military sphere, and then I started looking for other theories that could either resonate with a study of Sparta or seem to fit very nicely with the study of Sparta. When we began, as I said, we began with this idea of looking at the battle on Sphakteria as a good starting point or a catalyst for discussion on how we measure Spartan leadership, what factors go into how Spartans make decisions, and the battle on the island of Sphakteria seemed to be really a good jumping point or springboard for this. So the two modern theories I thought I could bring in at this point to our discussion of Spartan leadership start again. The first one I found in the military arena, and this was out of the Strategic Studies Institute. Professor Leonard Wong, who's been working with adaptive capacities with Bennis's Crucible experience. He did a study back in 2004, and they're ongoing, that he found that junior officers were learning to make decisions and becoming what he calls mentally agile, and that is used to operating independently, taking the initiative, adapting to changes. And when I read this, I thought, boy, that looks just like what we're seeing in the Spartan Agoge, with the boys being taught how to overcome different contexts, whether it's the weather or whether it's social or even physical challenges. It seemed like what he was looking at or speaking to was something I was reading in Xenophon or Plutarch about the early education of the Spartans. The springboard from that went from the adaptive capacity and this idea of junior officers learning how to interpret context into contextual intelligence. And this idea I found over and over again in a few different studies until I found a decent and pretty good definition in Matt Klutz's 2008 article, where he states this contextual intelligence is a construct that involves the ability to recognize, diagnose the plethora of contextual factors. And when I read that, I thought, wow, is that what's being shown on YouTube? So how do we switch that? We're having some obviously technical difficulties. When I say, so you guys are still on the screen. So that's what I have to do. All right, so I'm gonna try that. Thank you, Steve. Is that better, Steve? I'm sorry, everybody out there watching. This is, okay, we're all back on there. Oops. Right, I'm now having. Are we back on the YouTube now, Steve? Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. As I'm trying to, it's not letting me. Well, anyhow, I'll just read and hopefully people can listen along as the PowerPoint is, we're having a lot of technical difficulties here and I do apologize. What I'm trying to do is get the PowerPoint to play and it's not. I'm sorry, Steve, what is it?
If you start presenting from the PowerPoint itself.
Gotcha.
It should turn on the screen share.
Okay. There we go. Are we on screen share now?
It seems so.
No? All right, we'll just go with me. Mark Klutz defined this. Oh, we're up, good, okay. That is the ability to recognize and diagnose the plethora of contextual factors. And I read that and I thought, wow, that seems a loaded phrase. And I searched around and tried to break it down more using Klutz and others. And what it came down to is a leader who has contextual intelligence knows not only how to do something, but maybe more importantly, what to do. And what he's talking about is using past and vision, that is what is a preferred future, and he calls this your dual lens. So when a leader can look to the past and their past experiences and then use this as knowledge moving forward, they have some sort of contextual intelligence. And he defines context and he defines intelligence. What I found most interesting was how he used experience to define experience. And he said, experience is not just time. You can be 50 years old and have lots of experiences, but experience is really the ability to extract wisdom from different circumstances and experiences. So one can be young and have a lot less time doing something, but if it's a profound experience and you can extract wisdom from it, even 1 year teaching, you may find that you gain more experience than somebody who's been teaching for 20 years. So I took these two models of adaptive capacity and contextual intelligence, and I kind of merged them when I thought of what was going on at Thermopylae, what was going on with Leonidas, and what was going on with the development of the early Spartan system. And what I found was, as a modern audience, is it still not working?
It's from.
Okay, we're having a lot of troubles here, and I apologize. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna stop doing the screen share, and hopefully, can you see me now? Okay, we'll just do with that. What I saw with Leonidas was somebody who, whether it was his choice to march out of Sparta, whether it was his initial response to the Persian king of the famous come and get them, whether it was his decision to stay in the pass and fight it out, he had that contextual intelligence of being able to adapt to the environs, that contextual intelligence of being able to take on many different contextual factors, whether it was his troops' morales, the actual logistics of being in the pass, of dealing with the Spartan government at home, and following what we all believe the Spartans, from reading like Life of Lycurgus, from reading Xenophon, following that Spartan ethos. In fact, we know from Xenophon and we know from Herodotus, we have this story from Herodotus that before the battle, the exiled king Demaratus tells the Persian king that the Spartans fear the law more than the Persian subjects fear the Persian king. That law is their master. And we know from Xenophon that even the Spartan king swore an oath to follow the law. And nothing encapsulates this better than that epitaph found in Herodotus that after the battle, when all was said and done, and I've translated this and provided 3 or 4 different translations in the Latin and Greek section at the bottom of the module, at the end of the module. But the epitaph read, "Stranger who passed by, go tell the Spartans that obedient to our laws or obedient to our words, here we lie." There's no mention of Leonidas. There's no mention of the 300 or Dionysus. It's just we. And it's obedient to our laws or our words. And so when I think of Leonidas and I think of contextual intelligence, I see someone, whether it was real or the image presented by the writers, as somebody who was a leader we were rooting for, that we'd want to follow because of his competency, because he was somebody who didn't know just how to do something, but he knew the right answer and what to do and did it. So we do have our resident expert here. I'm going to turn it back over. I do apologize for the technical difficulties, but I think we're starting to iron them out. Our Stephen Graham is here with us. Wave, Stephen. There he is. He's here helping us out. And what we're going to do is turn it over. Dr. Amy Forbes, again, is our Associate Director for the Centennial Center for Leadership here. And our 2 students have already answered one of your questions. And it was really difficult to try to say, how does leadership change? It's actually because I say this is that we're also young here as first years, that really had a hard time grounding ourselves in how leadership has changed. So I'm going to give you my seat. Is that okay? If you don't mind wearing my earphones, and I'll go sit with one of my students.
Okay.
And
thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about this.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. This is a real treat to be asked to join. And I can already hear some really relevant themes that you were raising already, Professor McCready. And I think it's a great place to start when it comes to leadership, going back to our original texts and really studying some of our first knowledge with regards to literature. There are a lot of experts out there that think we don't need to produce any more leadership books. We simply need to study what we've already produced from the past, and we can learn quite a bit. We have a huge library over at our Centennial Center, with a wealth of different writers and scholars, but a lot of people really believe that we should turn back to some of our original texts and really study some of the work of the leaders in that, and we can learn quite a bit. At our center, we do 2 things. We study leaders and leadership, and then we develop leaders. So if you have an interest in becoming a leader yourself, you can come and work with us. We have a number of different programs that allow people to do that. But we also are really interested in studying leadership, which is really what it sounds to me like you've been doing this whole semester in your first-year seminar class. Leadership is a social phenomenon. I rarely meet somebody who doesn't have an opinion or some sort of experience in it. There's a lot of armchair quarterbacking when it comes to leadership. We all seem to have a sort of sense of what a right leader does and what a wrong leader does, what it's like when we experience good leadership or bad leadership. In the Western United States, we are especially fixated with leaders. In fact, when I ask people what leadership is, I frequently get a list of leadership traits, which is important and valuable and something to study, but it's certainly not all that encompasses the social phenomenon that is leadership. There are a lot of scholars that are coming to a very simple system, which is that leadership constitutes leaders, followers, and context. And a lot of this you already know. It sounds like you've been talking about it in class. Contextual intelligence, absolutely. And so there's a lot of scholars coming to now that leadership is really some sort of exchange, a relationship between leaders and followers. And the context that goes on between those exchanges is really what is of study and interest to them. And so when you talk about context, we use a number of different tools with our students to study context. One is a very simple business concept. It's called STEEPLED. It's an acronym, and it asks you to look through a number of different lenses. And they are, let me see if I can get them all, but it's social, technological, ethical, environmental, political, legal, economical, and then demographics. And so imagine if you're a leader and you have a decision to make, if you can put that decision through all of those multiple lenses and extract the wisdom that your experiences have garnered, that is a great way to analyze context. There are others out there. A lot of people would add history or culture or other components to that, but that's a simple tool that we often talk with our students about when it comes to context, and it's very valuable. You can't lead a classroom of fourth graders in the same way that you would a military unit, and so understanding the context is really important from situation to situation, and that's something that our literature is so good about teaching us when it comes to some of the readings that your class has been doing. I think that that's very valuable. But I think it's really interesting to ask, how has leadership changed from past to present? I'd be curious what you thought.
This was the question we asked, and we were kind of fumbling around with it. I think everybody didn't really know how.
Such a broad question.
It's a very broad question, but
You can look at anything pretty much. I'm sorry.
No,
Yeah.
they were great. They were great. The question I was thinking, just as when she mentioned this, is maybe technology. Is that? Do you see how technology maybe has changed at all leadership or the presentation of leadership? Is that even?
it's changed it tremendously, don't you think? Where
Yeah, I mean,
one of the oh, go ahead.
Especially during this campaign, I mean, you see Donald Trump using Twitter a lot, and
I'm doing okay.
that's one of the ways he's been able to get his message out. And you saw the same with Barack Obama utilized the internet and social media a lot during his previous campaigns, and this has really been a way for them to get their message out, and especially a way to connect with young people. In addition to that,
I feel as though with the technology, most of the younger people, I would say, who are heavy into technology have a more liberal standpoint as well. So I would say that the technology, they're able to express their views through their websites,
Right.
BuzzFeed and whatnot. And, when you see that, you start thinking about these things, and, it provokes thought through the internet. And before the technology, you read about it in the newspaper and throw it away. But, now if it's something that you wrap your mind around on the internet, and it's like, you read like a funny little something or another,
Yeah.
it helps spread their message.
it also puts these political figures more in the public eye, and you see more focus on, I mean, how Hillary Clinton just had pneumonia a week ago, and that was blown out of proportion in some ways, I think. And but just how these little small details are all of a sudden everyone knows about them, knows all these aspects of people's personal lives. And
So I do have to pay attention to the time. And the one thing, I know, Tony, you had one question that maybe you could ask, to put you on the spot, and we can bring other people in while it's too. But Tony, I had one question.
I do. It's kind of long, but
Okay.
to what extent can a good leader think freely by doubting and questioning the goals of his group? And is this an important skill in a leader? Is it something that should be discouraged, or does it depend on the situation?
It's a good question. I think it kind of talks about the way leadership has changed from past to present. I think the group, as you state, is critical to a follower's position or to a leader's position, more so than ever. So a leader's ability to go against his or her followers, or to appease them, or to get buy-in, or to have an ability to influence them is really the bread and butter of leadership today. When you talk about, I can't help but turn back to what you're talking about with technology. Technology has given us access to leaders like never before. We know more about our leaders than we ever have, and some would say to our detriment. Nobody needs to know this much about our politicians in a lot of ways, and so it's really been harmful to authority. We don't see authority figures in the same way that we have perhaps in the past, likely because we've seen them make errors, and especially in their personal lives, and we have access to this information, and so we find how very flawed our leaders actually are. And I think that has an impact on whether or not a leader really has power over a group anymore. So some would say that power and authority has really changed, and it's really about your ability to influence a group. And so your question is a really good one when it comes to considering how much power does a leader have when he or she would go against their group. Are they allowed to do that and still maintain their position or authority? Today, I think you see a lot of leaders lose their capacity to lead a group if they don't somehow figure out a way to maintain that sort of buy-in and relationships. There simply isn't the same sort of "you will do as I say because I said so" sort of authority, this absolute authority anymore. And so your ability to influence is really interesting.
We're gonna switch over to Steve. Steve, what do we have so far on the chat?
So far, we have a lot of questions and comments regarding our election system and if our process of electing leaders may be outdated due to the founding fathers' system. And there's a lot of discussion going on about that. It's very interesting to see.
All right, thank you, Steve. Well, I don't really have any answers right now for that if our current system is outdated.
If our current system of...
Yeah, is that what it was, Chase?
The founding fathers, like, what they couldn't anticipate, or like, I think.
Oh, that's interesting.
I've heard things,
Okay.
they couldn't anticipate that, so they would, their opinion wouldn't really have any relevance.
Okay.
As one person's argument.
All right. Well, thank you. I think we're gonna let you free. You're welcome to hang out with us as we hopefully have more technical difficulties.
You're doing great juggling all this. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Professor Forbes.
Yeah,
and we hope that we'll be able to bring you back. All right. Yeah, well, you're welcome to have some snacks too. Again, thanks everybody for your patience as we have our first live stream. And thanks, Steve. Anything else, Steve, on the live chat before we go into the next segment? Okay. Okay. Well, I think, Tony, we're going to bid you guys a farewell. And one less. Chris and Chris are ready. So as I had started, began the module with Pylos, then swerved back to the Battle of Thermopylae and Leonidas and brought in these concepts of contextual intelligence and adaptive capacity. I want to now get back to where we started in Media Res with the Battle of Pylos. And what we've been doing in our class is just throwing around ideas such as how do we measure leadership? How do we actually pass judgment on something like the Sphakteria episode, where Styphon and over 292 Spartans surrendered to the Athenians. We know that these Spartans eventually made their way back to Sparta. We know that some of them, Thucydides tells us at a later date, actually were holding office when the other Spartans thought we should deprive them of some citizenship rights, and so they were holding office, then removed from office, even deprived of some of the Spartiate rights. And then at a later date, Thucydides doesn't actually clarify, tells us that they were restored to their full citizen status. So what we want to do now is have a little fun with, we started with either the mock trial or debate idea, and we have two Chris's, and they're going to be sharing a computer as well. The first Chris Calder, will be giving us his opinion as to why the surrender on Sphakteria, is this right, Chris, is a good idea. The second Chris Ruspini, will giving us his take on why it was not such a good idea. They'll each have a minute or two to cross-examine one another. And then we're going to ask Abdul and Lucas to pass judgment on which side they think has made a better case for the surrender or no surrender at Sphakteria. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to you, Chris, right when I mute me, and you'll be on.
Okay, so we decided to start out with why the surrender of Pylos was a bad idea for Spartan culture. And essentially we're looking at the whole idea of Spartans live to fight and fight to die. And when they surrender, they go against the creed that they sort of developed, the society where they fight to the death no matter what situation they're in. And essentially what they're doing when they surrender is they're showing their citizens that the system that they grew up in isn't actually real. They don't truly believe in the system of fighting to the death and living for Sparta and being owned by the Spartans. And I see a huge problem with this because everything that the Spartans have known throughout their entire life is a lie exhibited through this surrender. And I believe that their people and their system in culture, or this creed that they developed, sort of falls after Pylos because they are unable to exhibit strength in a situation that made them rather weak. And this essentially forces the Spartans to look almost hypocritical because they will surrender in times of need and weakness rather than fight to the death.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. What I would say against that and why it's a good idea for them to surrender is because these are one of the most prominent and elite, or the elite athletes, not athletes, warriors of Sparta. And without these warriors and without their best warriors, you can't defeat the Athenians or anyone in the future. You want your best warriors. You don't want them to die on the battlefield when you know you can have a chance in the fight another day. You say that it goes against Spartan culture and how they are trained to fight and die as Spartan out on the battlefield and die for their country, when on the other side, if they live to fight another day and have the opportunity to come back stronger, and in that point of view, that they have a better chance of winning in the end.
The only problem that I see with this, when we look at what happens after they surrender, essentially what the Spartans are doing is sacrificing their citizenship and their recognition as Spartans. So because of what these people believe in, the second that they surrender, they are no longer Spartans. They're actually breaking what their mothers tell them, which is to come back on their shield or come back with honor. And if they decide not to die at battle, then they don't come back at all because they're no longer part of the systems the Spartans have developed.
Well, they're not running away from the fight and will never fight again. They're just surrendering and they'll fight another day. So they're not saying, they're not putting down their spears and their shields, and they're not saying we're never going to fight again. They will fight for their country once it's the right time and once they have all the proper materials and the proper men that they need.
But the problem there is the Spartans, they don't believe in that sort of scenario. They fight to the death, and that's supposed to be that recognition that the rest of the Peloponnesians identify. Spartans fight to die or to come home victorious. And the second that they decide not to fight for victory, that's when they are no longer Spartans.
All right, so we're going to have to turn it over to our.
So hearing
Is he being presented on YouTube, everybody? Steve? Was it Abdul?
Started doing it. Oh, it's a good delay. Yep, we're good.
So hearing both of them, firstly, considering that Spartan surrendered, this would be going against their creed, like Chris said, not being part of Sparta. As mentioned, Spartans provide, like, they live every daily life providing for Sparta, fighting for Sparta and dying for Sparta. Like, fighting for Sparta is like essential to them. And leaving the battlefield without dying on the battlefield or coming out victorious is like going against their own creed or their own ideology.
So are you deciding with?
I'm deciding with Chris Calder for this.
Well, I saw it as an odd situation, as the Spartans weren't really meant to be there how they were with the materials they had. They were supposed to be there for just picking off Athenian warriors coming to the beach. So they were not prepared for battle. But seeing that, the Spartans probably should have seen that coming, had some backup, some way of getting off the island, and be more prepared. And I think it might sound a little brutal, but they should have to pay the price and just fight to the death, I guess. But this is ancient Sparta, so, toughen up. Spartans guilty.
All right. Thank you, Lucas and Abdul. So we've got one for they should surrender, one they shouldn't have surrendered. Any chatter, Steve, on the chat?
Just some small discussion in regards to the Battle of Sphakteria, and there was an interesting point of the society changing due to social pressure. And yes, that's what the conversation seems to be at this point.
All right. Thanks, Stephen. John Esposito, are you with us? Can you hear us?
Yes, I am here.
All right, I'll get you on. We've had, I don't know, John, if you've been following, we've had a few technical difficulties. Some have just been trying to show PowerPoints while we broadcast. That was a failure. And then some of it, I think it was just my lack of technology. We practiced this yesterday and I thought I had it down, but that's a mea culpa. So where we are, if you've been listening, we've had one vote. Okay, so the Spartans shouldn't have surrendered, one had. And this is Dr. John Esposito, everybody. He's joining us. I'm going to get you up on the screen for everyone. Make sure I got this. Steve's going to check me on YouTube. Are we good, Steve? And do you see Dr. John Esposito?
In 5 seconds.
In 5 seconds. Okay, I see how it works now. So we bring in John's. There he is. Hi, John. John's going to give us a little glimpse into his module coming up in a couple of weeks. And we also thought he could give us a little bit about military intelligence in general and anything else, John, that you thought. We connected our module to yours through that OODA loop, although we haven't had a lot of time to do anything with it right now. But we thought we'd give the floor to you and your expertise on the connection with Sparta and your module, military intelligence, and anything else you might want to share with us.
Yes, thanks, Jim. So one thing that's striking me as interesting in this conversation is how military decisions, in terms of decisions made in context, and the notion of contextual intelligence or context-based decision-making is general. It applies in all sorts of circumstances. One of the peculiarities of a military situation, which is also somewhat present in a political situation, like in a political race or in a parliamentary system, but which is taken to an extreme in a military context, is that the context includes someone who is smart and is trying to beat you or maybe even kill you. So the difference between, say, contextual intelligence of responding to a change in the weather, as Demosthenes, the general, does effectively, and contextual intelligence in the sense of responding to some enemy general who's either negotiating with you, trying to trick you, maybe trying to annihilate you, or maybe by annihilating you, trying to destroy your whole city or way of life. There's a really big difference there. And the application of decision-making in a context in which an enemy is smart, maybe as smart as you, you'll assume that they're as smart as you, is something that ends up getting theorized quite a bit. In Thucydides, for one thing, also even I think in Homer, but then in general in military literature written for military commanders. So there's a long history of works on stratagems, or of general theoretical works on how, as a general, as a leader in the military, you need to trick other people and you need to be aware that they are going to trick you. More broadly, there's a great deal of importance placed on this idea that you have to be able to make a decision either before battle or in battle that's somehow better than and faster than your opponent. So here we get to the notion that it's not just important to make a decision, it's not just important to be able to take into account not simply the principles you're using, but also the context in which you apply those principles, but also the notion that you have to make the right decision, because if you don't make the right decision in battle, maybe you'll die, maybe your men will die, maybe your city will be destroyed. In Thucydides, this is particularly important. I mean, the context of specifically Thucydides' own life, and maybe Jim, if you could talk briefly, or if I can, if you want, about the context of Thucydides, the author and general, and his role at Amphipolis, or lack of role at Amphipolis, in the context of his discussion of Brasidas.
If you want to keep going for a couple of minutes, then I'll get into Brasidas. That would be great.
Okay, so without spoiling too much, we should remember that Brasidas, this wonderful, brilliant general who spoke not too badly for a Spartan, was also a general who captured, through a maybe merciful, maybe just very sly or strategic or clever move, captured a city defended by Athenians that Thucydides himself, as a general, was supposed to defend, but didn't. He was blamed for this, he was exiled for this, and he's the guy who's writing about Brasidas and about all of these other guys in the Peloponnesian War. This is something that's important to keep in mind. Thucydides is writing as a historian. We treat him as an historian, as a political historian, a political philosopher, but he was a general, and the Athenians considered him a seriously failed general. Jim will talk more about this when we get to Brasidas. But one of the other things that Brasidas is somewhat surprisingly good at for a Spartan, and is something that Athenians pride themselves on, is something that becomes increasingly important under the Macedonians when Philip and his son Alexander conquer much of the known Eurasian world island until India, and that's the ability to move quickly and to make decisions quickly. So in the modern world, in modern military theory, particularly in the United States, the notion that the ability to make the right decision faster than your enemy by noticing the context has been kind of formalized and quasi-mathematicized by an Air Force colonel named John Boyd. He developed this concept after Vietnam called the OODA loop, which is an acronym. It stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. And what he was saying was what he observed, and he used a bunch of computer simulations for this for reasons that seem not necessary to me, is that the fighter pilot wins in a dogfight if he notices things, observes things, right? Relates himself to those things. In this case, it's pretty much all hims, and that's the orientation. Makes a decision about what possible course of action to take, and actually then takes it, and that's decision and then action. This was partly inspired in Vietnam by an American military and technological doctrine that speed didn't matter in battle because the enemy in front of you's intelligence was not the most important thing. Instead, it was the enemy, the scientists, their ability to produce a superior warplane with superior missiles that was more important. And as a result, the much more expensive and much more technologically advanced American F-4 Phantoms, which didn't even have machine guns, had a much lower kill ratio against supposedly technically inferior Russian jets than the Americans thought they did, than they should have. And that's because the Russian jets are run by the North Vietnamese got in really close and had knife fights, dog fights with machine guns. The American planes were not great at that. John Boyd's theories influenced the development of the F-15 and the F-16, and have also been applied by modern strategic studies people to ancient military commanders, but particularly Alexander the Great. In my module, I talk about applying that to Caesar, but in general, the idea is that when you're in battle and you're making a decision in battle about how to respond to changing circumstances, you're going to win if you can observe, orient, decide, and act faster than your enemy can. And that's observing, orienting, deciding, acting on the enemy's actions, but also on anything else that happens, such as a change in the wind, or a fire springing up, or rain or lack of rain, or something like that. The brief introduction to the concept, I could apply it a little bit from more in the context of our meetings, or we could transition, because I know we don't have a lot of time left, to Brasidas.
Sorry, John, I was having problems with my microphone at that last 10 seconds. Steve, anything on the chat room we can include?
In regards to the chat room, nothing really, but there's interesting discussion on the education of democracy, and that very interesting. Chat room is stable.
All right, thank you. Well, we want to thank Dr. Esposito for giving us an introduction to your module. We do have a quick question for you though, John, before you leave. So when we look at Pylos and the surrender of the troops at Sphakteria, where would you side? Would you fault Styphon for surrendering? Did he not act quick enough? Did he, that OODA loop, did he not orient himself? Was he just a follower and it was somebody else maybe on the mainland who didn't act quick enough? Well, I know we're putting you on the spot. We're just having a little fun with this. But,
it's a good question. I personally would side with surrendering, and that's mostly because I would, as a Spartan, take victory as a value. And so I would not be betraying my values by winning the war, by not losing my men. And the other thing is that I would also, as a military leader, sympathize with my men. And I think that's actually something that Spartan military training did a good job of instilling. It's this strong relationship between the military commanders and the rank and file that others, because they didn't have as much time to train, didn't have. So I imagine you'd feel a little bit more closely that kind of responsibility, despite your general value of the Spartan mothers.
Well, you just sent Chris Calder to Fitz, who was arguing the other way, but thank you. That was put very eloquently. And again, thank you, Dr. Esposito, for giving us your time tonight, your expertise, and we look forward to seeing you in the Caesar module in just a couple of weeks, right?
Yes, thanks, Jim.
All right, well, stick around for the rest. We've got a couple of minutes left, and I'm going to switch. Steve, anything that we can bring in?
Not at the moment.
If we can do this. Steve, I'm going to try the screen sharing with the PowerPoint one more time. Please let me know if it does or doesn't work on YouTube. Is it up there?
It's just not responding.
But it's just a couple of seconds behind, I think.
We'll
get off that then. All right, are we back? No, that's okay. We've only got a couple of minutes left and we won't even bother. I'll send the PowerPoint out. That's, I think, the secondary. I think having the conversations is more important, but thank you, Chris. We've got a few minutes left, and what I wanted to do is introduce the last part of the module. What I had intended was this module to start from Thermopylae and end at Agesilaus II. In between, we obviously looked at Pylos, and I wanted to look at the General Brasidas that John Esposito referenced. Brasidas is interesting. He's called the Athenian among the Spartans, the best of the Athenians. He's the one who does new things. He was at Pylos and distinguished himself. He was courageous. He was fighting. He was one of the commanders of a trireme, and we're told that he took so many wounds that he fainted in his fighting. So he was this courageous warrior who, not much later, we see at Corinth, and who we're told by Thucydides was sent out by the Spartans, but mostly on his own initiative, and took with him a mixed force, some Peloponnesians, some Spartans, and also had 700 former serfs, the helots, attached to his army as well. So he had this real mixed bag, this mixed troop. And he was able to move and defend one city on the isthmus, Megara. He moved through Thessaly rather quickly up to Macedon. There he was supported by the Macedonian king, and although the Macedonian king wanted him to do one thing, Brasidas took it upon himself to use diplomacy in many different instances. And one of the speeches I have up there on the third part of the module is the speech of Brasidas to one of these towns that the Macedonian king probably would have rather seen Brasidas use force, but Brasidas stopped and used diplomacy, and it was to the Acanthians. And there's a couple of things, and I'll send the PowerPoint out, but there's a couple of things in this speech that are intriguing. The first is that Brasidas, after, again, moving all the way from the Peloponnesus up to Macedon rather quickly, here he is up in the Chalcidices, proclaiming that his goal is the liberation of Greece, to liberate the cities from the Athenian Empire, and that he's been instructed to do so by the Spartan government, that the Athenians have already run away from him once, and that he would not enslave and make these cities subject to the Spartans, but that he was really here in the name of liberation. He also throws a veiled threat in there. These Acanthians are worried about their wine, about their grapes, and he says, if you don't come over, I'll be forced to ravage the land. There are 2 points to fact check in his speech. One, the Athenians never really ran away from him. They came out to meet him, and when he didn't attack, the Athenians did retire, but he didn't beat them away, and they didn't run away. But he's not lying. He's just not telling the entire truth. The second part is we don't have any evidence in Thucydides that he had this authority to liberate them and not enroll them perhaps in the Peloponnesian League. Sparta had many dependent allies. So he's not, again, being a liar, and he's not, in fact, he's not telling them something that might not be true, but he's not entirely being true either, maybe because he's not a king and doesn't have that absolute authority. As time rolls on up in the Chalcidices, he wins a couple of more cities over to his side, over to the Spartan side, and eventually the Spartans and the Athenians sign a truce. Shortly after this truce, one of the cities switches sides to the Spartans, and the Spartans tell Brasidas that he has to allow the city to go back to the Athenians, and Brasidas objects. The truce, the armistice, fails, and Brasidas is once again seen in the area of Amphipolis. And I provided the second speech in part 3 of the module, where you can see Brasidas talking to his troops again about what their role is and what his role is as the leader. What's interesting, if you Wikipedia Brasidas and you read these 2 speeches, is to look at the character of Brasidas and how, like a Leonidas or how, like other leaders with contextual intelligence, he seems to understand all the factors at play. And yet, he's not getting a whole heck of a lot of support from the Spartans at home. He's, in fact, at one point confronted by some Spartans who come from the polis of Sparta, from his homeland, and they're commissioned as young officers to take charge of some of the cities he's won over. And we're told that the Sparta did this paranomos against their laws. Maybe it was too young. It was against the law to send soldiers who were so young out into the field to become governors of these cities. And that they were told to do this so that no decisions would be made and place people in positions of governorships on the spot. This could be seen as a dig at Brasidas, that the Spartan authorities were worried he was going to handpick the next governors of these cities, or maybe Spartan authorities were worried about locals handpicking somebody to be the governor. We don't really have much to go on, and we have to just stop there with Thucydides. But my point here is that Brasidas doesn't seem to be getting a whole heck of a lot of support from home, and he's operating with this mixed army, at times moving with speed, other times with patience, at times using diplomacy, at other times he's using force. And the Battle of Amphipolis at the beginning of Book 5 is a good example of him seizing the opportunity that Klutz discusses in his article, and that Professor Wong discusses in his monograph on adaptive capacity, that leaders know when to choose when the opportunity presents itself, when to make the choices based on that context. Unfortunately for the Spartans, Brasidas is wounded in the battle. Even though Cleon, the Athenian warhawk, is killed, Brasidas himself is wounded and dies from his wounds. But I hope people have a chance to read Brasidas, at least the 2 speeches, and see how he compares to Leonidas, how he might compare to what you've read about the Spartan ethos and leadership in Plutarch or Xenophon. And then if you have more time, I've selected about 10 pages for deeper cuts on King Agesilaus II, where I was hoping this module would end. And I hope you have a chance to read a little Xenophon and ask the same questions. What characters of a leader does this writer choose to focus on with Agesilaus II? I'm looking at our clock. We're out of time. I want to thank Professor Forbes for coming in, everybody for listening, for dealing with our technical difficulties in especially the beginning. Before we go, Stephen, are there anything on the chat room we could bring in for a conclusion?
A recent poll was put up in regards to education and what would you cut out of it to focus on civic and democratic life.
What would you cut out of education? Anybody? Well, it was a slip of the tongue.
The choices were athletics, mathematics, science, the arts, business, and other. And so far, the arts and other are the leading votes.
But we wouldn't cut out classics, right?
Classics is not up there, so classics are safe.
Good, I'm glad that classics isn't up there, everybody. Stephen, thanks for moderating the chat room. Well, we're going to bid everybody a farewell. Thank you for tuning in. Professor Forbes, again, thank you. Dr. Esposito, a heartwarming thank you for joining us. We look forward to your module. Stay tuned for next week's module. Also, shout out to Jackson, too, all our first years in this class. For those that couldn't be here because you're in theater and athletics, we say hi. Devin, Morgan, Grady, Elizabeth, all of you out there who are missing, Rue and Jack. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow and getting to talk more. Thanks for tuning in. As they say in the pub, you can't stay here, but you don't have to go home. Have a wonderful night, everybody, and we'll see you next week.